what I wanted to say to introduce you, Tim, is that I first encountered your name associated with climate, with Coal Action News Aotearoa, and the newsletter that I of course get. And then in one of them years ago, there was a poem, and it was a lovely poem, and it spoke to me. And so I bought this book called New Zealand, and I would like to read page 27 for those of you who want to look it up. Not for me, the sunlit uplands. So, not for me, the sunlit uplands. I'm down in the trenches, fighting over inches, kilograms of emissions, redesigning systems, writing notes for speeches that no one delivers. Not for me, the broad brush. I'm collating submissions, seeking permissions, speaking at hearings, gathering evidence, setting out precedents that might persuade commissioners. Not for me, the grand gesture. I'm critiquing positions, building coalitions, planning occupations, opposing mining interests, finding all our futures are hostage to our actions. Wonderful, Tim. Over to you.
Thank you, Pat. Yes, that poem also appeared in an anthology of New Zealand climate poetry called No Other Place to Stand. And actually, I was a bit, although I'm proud of the poem, all those other poems were so aspirational and like determined. And mine was a bit like, oh, this is very hard work. So I actually don't think it was such a good idea to put it in there. Can I just ask folks, anybody who isn't on mute to mute, please, just so we have a...
Yeah, thank you.
Don't get any echo. So I've got a presentation which covers, say, the 3 areas I mentioned earlier. So it's a bit of a strange mixture, but hopefully it holds together. I'll be talking about climate writing. I'll be talking about climate action and activism, and I'll be talking a bit about climate politics and policy. Just a little bit about myself before I get into the presentation. I wasn't born in Aotearoa. I was born in the north of England. My family immigrated when I was 2, and I grew up in Southland, went to Dunedin for university, lived there for a while. I've now lived in Te Whanganui, Otago, Wellington since 1993, so quite a while now. And each of those places tends to have some connection with both my activism and my writing. So I'm going to try sharing my presentation and we will get into it. Here we go. And there we go. So can I just check, can people see the presentation? Somebody just, James, I can see you on the screen. Can you just give a thumbs up if you can see it? Brilliant. Thank you very much. So I'll probably be talking for 30 to 35 minutes. We'll see how we go. This is very much notes. It's not a fully written out presentation. So where to from here? Perspectives from a climate fiction writer and climate activist. Now I just have to persuade it to go to the next screen. There we go. So I'll talk a bit about myself as an activist and I'll talk about myself as a writer. Don't worry, I don't spend the whole presentation talking about myself, an attractive prospect though I'm sure that is. So I first got involved in environmental issues at Gore High School, and that was way back in the days of the Save Motorway campaign. I was at Gore High from 1971 to 1975, so that was the peak period of that campaign. For those folks who may not have been around during that time, that was the campaign against an enormous raise of the lake levels of Lake Manapori to produce hydropower, basically flooding the entire area. And that, of course, was a successful campaign. I mean, I wasn't actively involved in it, but its success made an impression on me at the same time as I was getting very involved in environmental and ecological issues. I went to Otago University. I volunteered at the Dunedin Environment Centre, and I got involved in the Save Aramoana campaign. That was the campaign against building an aluminium smelter at the entrance to Otago Harbour. That was part of the National Party, the Muldoon government's Think Big plans. It was there was a thing in those days called the National Development Bill, and it was the idea was that you got rid of all environmental restrictions so you could fast track projects that the government wanted, and environmental opposition and any popular opposition was just discounted. This government, in my view, the current government we have, is basically the Muldoon government crossed with the Douglas government from the 80s. It's not a pretty picture. I'll return to that. A bunch of stuff happened. I got burnt out, got married, had a child. I think it's not uncommon for people in there are probably people in this call who are committed activists in their 30s and 40s, but I know a number of people like myself who were activists in their teens and 20s. Circumstances meant that they stopped doing that for a while and then they got back into it later, and that was the case for me. I returned to activism in the early 2000s. I was very focused on climate change. I started with involvement in the Sustainable Energy Forum, which some folks here may have heard of, which is kind of weird because they're mainly engineers. Ian will have heard of course. I know at least we've got Ian on the call who's been actively involved in that. I'm not an engineer, and yet somehow I ended up as the convener of this organisation of engineers. Now, in 2007, I joined Coal Action Network Aotearoa. I've got the little symbol there. That's the campaign to end coal mining and use in Aotearoa, as I'll refer to later. Surely ending coal use, especially thermal coal, that is coal that's burned for heat or for electricity production, is the lowest of low-hanging fruit. And yet it's been a lot of hard work to make any progress on that issue. And now we have a government which is trying to reverse it. I won't spend the entire webinar complaining about this government, but it may crop up from time to time. The other area I got involved in campaigning and continue to be involved in is the campaign for low carbon transport. I'm a keen cricket fan. I live quite close to the Basin Reserve, and for that reason, but also for transport and climate reasons, in round about 2011, I got involved in the Save the Basin Campaign, which was a campaign against building a motorway flyover at the Basin Reserve cricket ground. That was part of the then national government's Roads of National Significance projects. We managed to defeat that project. Now, of course, Roads of National Significance are back. So there's a bit of a theme of the return of bad stuff in this presentation. As an author, I've been writing fiction and poetry since the 1990s. My first short story collection, Extreme Weather Events, hopefully you can see that, was published in 2001, and I guess the title shows that I was at least paying the attention to the issues, even though it isn't really well, it's environmental fiction, I guess. You've just, thank you very much, Pat, for doing that lovely reading from my collection, New Sea Land. So that was about half the poems in that book are in some way about sea level rise. And then I wrote this climate fiction novella, which is set about 30 years in the future, and basically deals with issues of people forced to emigrate because of sea level rise. And then my latest book, which if we have time, I'll read a short extract from later, is the one you pictured there, which is Emergency Weather, which is a very near future climate fiction novel. And I'll talk about that soon. So in it, the climate emergency crashes headfirst into the lives of 3 ordinary New Zealanders. Let's just get that screen to go on. There we go. So Emergency Weather has got 3 main characters. There's Ali, who's a struggling farmer trying to make a go of it. I should say a South Otago farmer, struggling to make a go of it in worsening climate conditions and worsening financial and personal circumstances. There's Stephanie. She's a climate scientist, lives in Wellington, working in the bureaucracy, committed to climate action and trying to make a difference within the system. She starts the novel consumed by despair at the gap between climate rhetoric and climate action in Aotearoa. And there's Zeke, a young Māori man, lives at the East Coast. His whānau is displaced by flooding, and he winds up in the path of an even bigger weather bomb. These are three characters whose stories become entangled as the novel proceeds. Climate change affects us differently. But if we're poor or if we live in vulnerable communities, it affects us worse and earlier. But it does affect us all. And I think that's an important message to get across. And I think we saw that very clearly in the Auckland flooding, where the people who had less money, who were living in more vulnerable places, got affected. But we also saw the mansions of the rich sliding down hillsides. And I think that's a really important point to make and to emphasize. So now I'm going to take a wee detour into politics, except of course it's not really a detour because there's a strong political thread in the novel. I mentioned the character Ali, who is a farmer in South Otago. Her brother-in-law, Matt, is the Minister for Resilience, a new position that I invented under a government. When I was writing this novel, it took me 5 years, although a lot of it was spent doing other things, and I had to be aware there was likely to be a change of political direction at some point given our 3-year electoral cycle. And so I tried to create a government which could plausibly be either somewhat to the right of Labour or somewhat to the left of National. As it went on, it's fictional, and I want to stress the novel is fiction, but it became a government not unlike the previous one, which was great at soaring climate rhetoric and not quite so great at delivering climate action. In my view, climate politics in New Zealand is bedeviled by the virtually unchecked power of vested interests. And those vested interests include, for example, the fossil fuel lobby, the trucking lobby and the roading lobby, and federated farmers and the groups to their right. Obviously, Groundswell is one of them. In case people think that Groundswell is some organisation of honest farmers just trying to do their best against a cruel and oppressive government, not so. It's an astroturf set up by people like the Taxpayers Union. Of course, it has genuine farmers in it, but it's not a grassroots organisation. These groups have and exercise a great deal of financial and institutional power, and we have a political system that makes it supremely easy for them to do so, because we all have very little transparency, almost no checks and balances, and a system which rewards short-term thinking and penalises long-term thinking. It is possible to fight and defeat them, and they have been fought and defeated, but it's a tough gig. For instance, with the oil and gas ban, I know there are folks on this call and people all around Aotearoa, Pākehā and Māori, activists, iwi, who did an enormous amount of work to defeat the oil companies and get that ban in place. Now we have to fight that. That fight is happening again. We can win it again, but it's a lot of hard work. Good thing about New Zealand, well, a good thing about New Zealand, if you've got a lot of money, vested interests can effectively buy the policies they want at surprisingly reasonable prices, I have to say. It's a bargain. The example I like to use, although it is a simplification, is in 2008, the Road Transport Forum made, if I recall correctly, and I'm going to say the number, I hope it's right, a $55,000 donation to the National Party. Pretty good return on investment. They got a $12 million Roads of National Significance program out the other end. Now, of course, that's simplifying things. And there is a catch. You can donate with a strong likelihood of getting the policies you want if they are aligned with the political direction of the party you're donating to and if it comes to power. We saw during the previous election campaign, there was a group campaigning to maintain the clean car discount. It spent a lot of money campaigning to do that in terms of political third-party advertising. But because the incoming government was ideologically opposed to that, that part of their campaign was not successful. you might think I'm being cynical here, and perhaps I am. But I think that, and I'm going to do some. I'm a member of the climate movement. I'm going to make some criticisms of the movement, which apply as much to me as anybody else during this presentation. But I think it's really important to remember that this is not, in any sense, a level playing field. Even the largest climate groups, even those that get overseas funding, are tiddlers by comparison with the financial, economic, and lobbying power of the vested interests that benefit from the continuation of our fossil fuel powered economy and from the continuation of industrial agriculture. Now I've already listened with great interest to Sir Peter Gluckman's recent presentation, and to echo some of the things he said, the endemic short-termism of New Zealand politics and the ability of an incoming government to wipe out the previous government policies at the stroke of a pen makes it very hard to develop effective climate policy, because climate policy needs to be long-term. And yet, because of in New Zealand, the idea that Parliament is sovereign, it's very easy, as I say, to just wipe out the previous government's policies and either replace them with bad policies or replace them with nothing. And once again, we're seeing this play out at the moment. Just to say, I know there's a bit of a gloomy thread here. I'm not going to be gloomy for the whole presentation. So if you love gloom, prepare to be disappointed a little. See, next one. So in terms of, again, talking in terms of climate policy, and I know of course, climate is only one of the aspects of the crisis we face. And indeed, many of the issues tie in very closely with biodiversity. I only have limited time, so I'm focusing here on climate, but many of these arguments apply to other things as well. So, a few years ago, I was clearing out some old papers, and I happened to find, I think from when I started to get involved with the Sustainable Energy Forum, so the early 2000s, I happened to find a bunch of old papers that I got sitting in a drawer somewhere. And it was depressing to read those, because they were talking about things like reducing coal use and decarbonising transport as low-hanging fruit. Things that we could do now. By now, I mean the early 2000s. Things that we could do before we got onto the difficult stuff. And yet here we are, and we've got a government that has taken away the restrictions on coal use, at least some of them, that the previous government put in. Decarbonising industrial heat, it's not, there are complexities to it, but it is doable. And now we've done some of it, and I will give credit to the previous government that that is an area they focused on and did take action and did do real things, like making significant moves to decarbonise, to help Fonterra decarbonise. I've got a little asterisk there I'll come back to, and to help New Zealand Steel decarbonise. Now, yes, I know that there's a corporate welfare argument there, right? Why are we giving these rich corporations money to reduce their emissions? And that's a valid argument, but the point is that what we were doing before that, under the emissions trading scheme, was giving those companies money to continue to emit carbon. So if we're going to have corporate welfare, let's at least use it to decarbonise, not pollute more. Then there's the famous too hard basket. And I think in New Zealand politics, agriculture and forestry are in the too hard basket. I mean, I'm not saying there should be. I'm not saying that there isn't a solution. I'm saying that when politicians and political parties approach those, they generally run away in pretty short order. Agriculture gets the headlines on that, and of course we've seen the total backing away from it of the current government in terms of making agriculture pay its share of emissions, given what a huge component is New Zealand emissions. But the policy roundabout on forestry and carbon credits has arguably been even worse, game of pass the parcel powered by successive governments' unwillingness to actually reduce gross emissions. Then we've got what we can look at a number of ways. You could call it, in a negative sense, the culture wars basket, in a positive sense, the just transition basket. These are the areas of emissions reduction, for example, transport, that are largely doable technically and economically, but often cynically undermined by culture war politics. However, an important note is that the culture war politics work in many cases because of the equity issues and because poor people are expected to pay the same burden as rich people. A classic one, of course, is electric vehicles. Now, if somebody's working for low carbon transport, I do not believe that simply replacing internal engine cars with internal combustion engine cars with electric cars is the whole solution, because public transport, walking and cycling, especially in towns and cities, is key. But if you do not make it possible for anybody but rich people to pay the upfront cost of electric cars, then it is no wonder that there is now not much uptake. And then you get the culture war stuff, the classic one. You're seeing it happening in the US, for example, where the gas industry and allied politicians are creating this huge culture war about, they're coming for my gas cooker. The idea being that people people have some sacred right to cook with gas, that cooking with electricity is terrible, and oh my God, our freedoms are being taken. In reality, electricity is fine to cook with. It's cheaper to cook with, but again, there's the upfront cost of replacing gas with electric. That's a role where the government needs to step in and make it possible to do that, because if people are helped to do that, they will save money and we will reduce emissions. It's the proverbial win-win. So, of course, I don't think I need to tell anybody that the current government has been beating the culture wars drum very heavily. I've already actually covered, covered most of this slide. It's good to see Labor put in some tentative moves towards a just transition, which is basically, particularly in their case, they're focusing on helping workers in carbon intensive jobs go into low carbon jobs, but it's also about helping communities, and it's about helping people who can't afford the costs to decarbonise. If you don't do that, then it makes it super easy for the right to play the culture wars cards and prevent action. Just check how I'm going here. Right. So where do climate campaigners need to be? In the room where decisions are made, or outside banging on the windows? I make this question literal in emergency weather. I hope it's not giving too many spoilers to say that the novel starts with the effects of a storm and ends with the effects of a bigger storm hitting Wellington. As the storm rises, Stephanie is inside the room. She's the climate scientist, believing she's making a difference, while Zeke and other rangatahi are outside banging on the windows, literally demanding to be let in. So my provisional answer is both. That you need people who are in the room engaging with the officials and politicians, however frustrating that is, and you need people outside the room, metaphorically or literally banging on the windows. A failing of the New Zealand climate movement, which is a failing I share, is that people confuse tactics with strategy. So groups tend to fixate on one particular tactical approach rather than planning a campaign that uses different methods as needed. So rather than what are we trying to do, what means are, thinking like this, what is it we're trying to achieve? What range of means are available to us to achieve that? How do we use these means at different stages of a campaign? Groups tend to get stuck in one particular approach. We're a group that does some, I'm not saying our climate declaration, sorry. Hypothetical group A is a group that does submissions. Hypothetical group B is a group that does lots of social media. Hypothetical group C is a direct action group. All those things are important in my view. And of course, to some extent, they appeal to different people and in different stages of their life. What's important is to have those tools available and take a strategic approach to how to use them. That's quite easy to say, but quite a lot harder to do, I have to say. And there's also the idea there, of course, that you need both a radical flank and a moderate flank. So that the radical, again, this is a simplification, the radical flank makes the moderate flank look reasonable by comparison. Now, there are dangers with that because the radical flank can potentially be very, very effective or can alienate so many people that it makes the work of the moderate flank impossible. I want to talk a little bit about my character, Ali. And this was a very interesting character for me to write because she is a farmer. Now, I grew up in rural Southland, but not in a farming family. I was, as a teenager attending Gore High School, my perspective was that the farmers' sons acted as though they owned the place and everybody else was beneath notice. So I had a big chip in my shoulder about farming, on my shoulder about farming families. And the success of farming lobby groups in blocking effective action on water pollution and agricultural emissions has been a source of immense frustration to me. So, however, Ali is not a villain in the novel. Ali is a farmer who is trying to do the right thing in terms of her farm and in terms of her life, but keeps being blocked by a range of circumstances. Excuse me. So making a dairy farmer one of my main protagonists was an exercise in empathy, in trying to see the world from a different perspective and showing that to the reader. One of the great strengths of fiction is that it can put you in someone else's shoes. Of course, it's up to the writer, it's up to the reader to determine whether that's done effectively. And of course, I hope you read Emergency Weather if you haven't already, and that you can judge for yourself whether I've done a good job of putting you in Ali's shoes, in Stephanie's shoes, and in Zeke's shoes. They each come from different places, both geographically and in terms of who they are, but all of them are forced by circumstances to respond to the climate emergency. And that's true of everybody. We all have to respond. We don't have it, you can't ignore it anymore. There was a long time during which people could potentially think, whatever, it doesn't apply to me, it's in the future, other parts of the world, I've got other stuff in my life, as everybody has. Not true anymore. It's hitting us. Cyclone Gabriel, if previous events didn't show that, Cyclone Gabriel most certainly did. However, as we'll see, the political effects of that certainly haven't been what I expected them to be. So, what's the sequel to the current climate retrenchment we have in New Zealand? A retrenchment which, in my view, in terms of climate policy, started under Chris Hipkins when he became Prime Minister and had his famous bonfire of climate policies, which completely opened up the space for National to do worse. Will we go to full-on Trumpist climate denial? Will we have a swing back to centrist incrementalism? Or will we take an approach as a nation that recognises physical reality and its demands on it? Thomas Nash, who's a councillor here, regional councillor here in Wellington, thinks the current movement calls for the current moment calls for widening our scope. He says, more important than ever right now that political movements advancing climate and environmental concerns provide answers to the everyday concerns of working people. Housing and transport are two areas on the front line where we can and must get it right. And of course, this is partly referring to the backlash within the EU on climate policy. And I think that stuff is really important. It's, again, like many things, a lot easier to say than do. But yes, if we're going to build a lasting, effective climate movement that actually achieves meaningful change, we have not built enough political support to do it. And even if working class New Zealanders don't want to engage in a getting involved positive way, or don't have the space, the time, the money in their lives to do so, if they perceive, and if the politicians who amplify these issues perceive or can show that climate action is going to make those folks' life more difficult, we are not going to succeed. I think that's really important. And I'd also say that achieving lasting progress on climate and environment in Aotearoa is intertwined with Te Tiriti and Tino Rangatiratanga. And if you doubt that, I'd suggest that you look at what the government and its backers are currently doing. They are trying to carry out a massive resource grab. We know from the Fast Track Approvals Bill that they are trying to sweep away every environmental protection so they can grab the resources and profit from them. They know that Te Tiriti and the kaitiatitanga responsibilities of many iwi are a key obstacle between them. And in my view, that is why they are so focused on weakening Te Tiriti, or attempting to weaken Te Tiriti, and weakening Te Tiriti-based protections. So I think that is a moral imperative to support those things, but is also a really strong imperative pragmatically and politically to support Te Tiriti, Toitu Te Tiriti, and to get in behind Māori opposition to what the government's trying to do. So we face, at least till 2026, or it seems we do, unless the coalition falls apart completely, we face a national-led, hard-right, anti-environmental, anti-climate government. I think the government's been in power for long enough that any hopes they might be other than what they appear are false hopes. They are what they appear, and they are trying to do as much damage as they can from an environmental climate point of view during the time they're there. What to do? Well, in my view, at least unless the current government puts forward serious climate proposals, and I think Simon Watt's 3-page 5 principles document that came out, I think, today, it doesn't exactly constitute serious proposals. Getting rid of the present coalition is key to making any progress on climate policy. And therefore, as campaigners, concentrating effort on where the government is weakest makes sense. In the environmental and climate field, that, in my view, is the Fast Track Approval Bill, which even many national supporters do not like, and the projects that emerge from that. As I mentioned already, I think Pākehā climate groups should always support Te Tiriti, but this is a really key time to do it because the government's trying to sweep away those protections too. Otherwise, I think the next 2 and a bit years can be used for movement building and trying to get wins outside the area of central government through councils, through building support for action in the business community. I am a left-winger, and it probably comes across. That doesn't mean that I think the business community are automatically baddies on climate. The reality is there are some big, powerful vested interests that don't want action. There are some other interests, not with as much power, that do want action. And I think to the extent we can work together with those, that's great. Unions in the Labour Party. The time to change a political party's policies is when they're in opposition. It's a tough gig, but if we can get a Labour Party, if and when it returns to power, with stronger climate policies, at least to start with, I think that could be pretty significant. Projecting a bit further out, it's likely there'll be more climate disasters in Aotearoa over the next few years, but Cyclone Gabrielle didn't move the needle in the direction I hoped. What happened basically was, Cyclone Gabrielle happened, I thought, naively, at last they'll have to listen to the climate movement. What actually happened was they listened to the trucking lobby, who seized the moment brilliantly and said, oh, climate change, it's terrible, it's so bad. What do we need? More motorways. We have to have more motorways for resilience. And of course, it's true that there are parts of New Zealand that really do need good roads, but adding more emissions by inducing more vehicles to go on more roads is not the kind of contribution to climate action that we need. It's the opposite. We face the risk that institutions will give up on emissions reduction and our international commitments and focus only on climate adaptation. There's this framing, and I was talking to somebody quite a bit younger than me recently at an event in Dunedin. Basically, she said that, and this is only, of course, it's only one person, that she and her friends, these are like people in their 20s, I guess, have heard so much about climate change, it kind of each new thing just washes over them now. And there's this idea of the new normal, right? Oh, well, climate change is the new normal, we can adapt. Well, maybe we can adapt up to a point, but if no action is taken on emissions or on the other crises we face, there comes a point when adaptation won't work anymore. The current government sidelined the Climate Change Commission, although it hasn't yet quite dared to get rid of it. Will a future government empower the Commission so it can actually do something meaningful, or at least follow its recommendations? Even Labor, towards the end of its term, ignored the Commission's recommendations. So I think the Climate Commission has plenty of deficiencies, but I think at minimum we need to try and keep it in there. Again, we need institutions that can look beyond electoral cycles, the sort of thing that Sir Peter was talking about. Add 2040, the 200th anniversary of Te Tiriti o Waitangi, looms a key year in both climate and constitutional terms. And I think, although I know we have a lot to do, I think also focusing on how Aotearoa is governed and the arrangements between the treaty partners is very important and plays into this. Right, we're getting close to the end, but I just want to talk about, actually I might not read, we're getting probably spend a little too much time, so I won't read a passage from the book at this point anyway, but Stephanie starts the novel in despair. She has had it. She's had it with government inaction. She's had it with telling the truth and nobody listens. She's had it with presenting the graphs that nobody pays attention to. She's in a state of despair, and she's very much inclined towards climate doomerism. Things that, i.e., it's too late, we're all screwed, there's nothing we can do. And so the person who's presenting that position usually says, I'm off to retire to my comfortable cottage in the Cotswolds. I think that's morally wrong. Stephanie comes to a different position during the course of the novel. But I also have to say I'm tired, and I expect a lot of us are tired. A lot of the time, climate activism feels like bashing your head against a brick wall. This is where I was going to read Not For Me, the Sunlit Uplands, which I wrote in 2016 and which kind of expresses that view. I'm a firm believer that tired people need time to rest and recharge, and maybe switch their attention to something more rewarding. But I think climate doomerism, loudly proclaiming there's no hope, is morally wrong. Even if it looks like there's no hope, I don't think we have the right, or any of us who feel that way, have the right to make that decision for other people, or to try and minimise their efforts to get action to reduce emissions. Even if it looks like there's no hope, saying so gives comfort to our enemies, such as the fossil fuel companies, and weakens our friends who continue to struggle for their lives and for the future. I'm just briefly going to mention a few books. These are a few that I've read recently. I can recommend each of them, though in different ways. Fire Weather is half of it is an amazing book, and the other half is an interesting book. It's about the Fort McMurray fires in, I may have the date wrong here, 2018. The archetypal North American oil town, in this case oil shale, which was invaded by ferocious forest fires, which of course were partly exacerbated by the very burning of that shale. Touching on the issue of tiredness was this book, Burnout, The Emotional Experience of Political Defeat. I was feeling pretty burnt out when the current government came in, and that book helped me. It's perhaps a little more academic than I was looking for, but it definitely helped me think about that issue in new ways. because I think it emphasised one of the chapters in that book is called exhaustion, and sometimes people are just tired and they have to rest. And a book which was interesting, I think perhaps skipped over some of the complexities a bit, was Not the End of the World, How We Can Be the First Generation to Build a Sustainable Planet. Definitely worth a read. It doesn't say we should worry about climate change. It does say some of the things that people concerned about climate change and the environment tend to worry about the most may not be the most important things to focus on. So there's just 3 books I've been reading recently that I think are worth reading. I'd be remiss if I didn't say that I think my novel Emergency Weather is also well worth reading. Now, a couple more slides here, I think. Climate groups are often quite fractious. There was a statement, I don't know who made it, sorry, I wish I could give credit, that something along the lines of, I couldn't possibly join your group. I only agree with 94% of what you say. And it's true, there are a lot of groups in the climate movement. They don't always get on. Groups of humans don't always get on generally. It's a lot easier to reach agreement once you're faced with a common enemy. And that has certainly been the case with the Fast Track Bill. If you look out for, if you hop on the web and search for communities against the Fast Track, you'll find a coalition of groups that are working to oppose that bill and oppose the projects that the government is trying to fast track. There's a sign up there. I really encourage people to hop on there and get involved. We already know, incidentally, that fast track bill has been delayed by a bit over a month. The government recognises that it's in trouble with it. It will try to make the bill look more palatable, but still, in my view, fundamentally removing participation by tangata whenua, or removing or severely reducing participation by tangata whenua, by the public and by locals for the sake of environmentally and climate destructive projects that will, in Shane Jones's immortal words, say goodbye to Fruity the Frog. I wish they were mortal words, unfortunately. I'd say that is one place the government is vulnerable, and we need to keep pushing and pushing on that. So it's important not to sweep differences under the carpet, but I think the next 2 years is a good time for alliance building, regionally, nationally, and internationally. Now, I live in Wellington where everybody fights all the time about everything. It's my impression, perhaps naively, that Nelson Tasman seems to do alliance building a whole lot better than Wellington. Please show me your ways, Nelson Tasman people. And we need to find constructive ways to work together on goals held in common and respectful ways to disagree. I've started writing a sequel to Emergency Weather. There's a climate crime thread of Emergency Weather. There's also a typo in this paragraph. So one of the threads I'm planning to follow in that novel is, what is the moral responsibility of fossil fuel company executives for their company's role in destroying the climate? Who holds them to account and how? I'm looking forward to writing it. When I started writing Emergency Weather, it was 2019. It almost got and it was set in the near future. It almost got overtaken by events with Cyclone Gabrielle. I'm really hoping, for both my sake as an author and for the sake of the country, that the sequel is not overtaken by events. And just to finish off, if you're very keen on social media, I'm sure everybody on this call is, then there are places that you can find the book, and there are some of my socials. And thank you very much. I'll just hold that for a moment and then I'll stop sharing. And I'm very happy to answer questions, whether they're about writing, activism, policy, hear comments, whatever people would like to do.
Okay. Do I hand over now to Bev? Yes. Bev? Are you going to, no? Okay, questions. Good, we have one from Paul straight off. Paul.
Oh, kia ora, Tim. I think that was fantastic, the way you put things together. I just wonder what you feel about our local political scene. A lot of people are talking about relocalisation, And I know that in Wellington, I think there's hundreds of groups that are involved with pest eradication and restoration type things. There's heaps of people that recognise the benefit of cycling, but unfortunately, our media, in particular the Post, seems to nitpick and emphasise the opposition to things like cycleways and restoration. But how can we make relocalisation really sing? Is it just the informal networks, or can we do it through the media as well?
Well, I've tried not to be too cynical during this call, but there's a cynical statement that freedom of the media or freedom of the press is owning one. And however, we've also seen what happens to societies when the traditional media declines and social media becomes the prime source of information. So I think the press has taken a notable swing to the right. Sorry, not the press. The Post has taken a notable swing to the right under its current editor. Stuff has reduced its number of climate journalists. I thought they did a very good job with the Forever Project. I mean, I suppose it's a traditional and boring answer, but I'd say that if we want to influence what goes in the Post or any other newspaper, then the thing to do is write op-eds, write from a variety of perspectives. So I've certainly had, op-eds are like those 650 or so word pieces, which are like opinion pieces. Write letters to the editor. That's something I don't do enough, but it is still effective, and politicians pay attention to them. As for relocalisation, the government came to power talking a lot about the fact that central government, the previous government, had taken power away from localities. Now, of course, we have the Fast Track Bill and other legislation, which is exactly designed to take power away from localities and communities and put it in the hands of central government. So I don't have Paul, I wish I did have a better answer on that topic. I think that, I think it's just really important that groups cooperate and take the view that, yes, we're not going to agree on everything, but let's at least find the things that we can work together on. Maybe they're quite narrow. Maybe it's one thing that the two groups agree on. We say, okay, we can work together on this thing. Let's work together on it. We'd like to resolve our other differences, and we'll try to do that, but let's make an agreement to work on this stuff that we agree on. I think that would be really helpful. It also takes quite a lot of work.
Jack has a hand up.
Thank you, Pat, and great talk, Tim. Thank you for that. You've addressed the issue of strategy rather than tactics, and emphasizing the importance of groups working together. Can you say a bit more about what a climate strategy might look like that involve various groups, and perhaps say a bit more about the benefits of having a strategy with those groups working together? Because clearly the deniers and delayers act strategically, and we're at a disadvantage because we don't.
Yes, you've cunningly asked me about my weak point. I hope there are other people on the call who are more strategic than I am. I know, I'll just make the disclaimers before I actually answer your question. I know that for me, I am very prone to getting sucked into things like this mail out has to be done by the end of the week, rather than what is our strategy? What are we actually trying to achieve here? When I think about strategy, I mentioned the Save Aotearoa campaign earlier, which was run, that was quite a big campaign. It actually brought people from a whole lot of groups together. There was folks from Otago Marae, there were people from Otago Peninsula, there were townies, there were folks who lived out in the country. It was an excellent example, actually, of a bunch of people who probably on many other issues would disagree a lot, but they were brought together by good organising. Not me, I was an absolute newbie in those days, and they were brought together when I say commitment to non-violent direct action, I don't just mean there was a commitment not to take violent action, although there was, but there's a lot of work done in the 70s and 80s in the non-violent direct action movement. And I hope you don't mind me saying, Carol, but Carol, you know more about this than I do, on how to organise campaigns to make in stages to make the best use of the resources available. There's a great book called Resource Manual for a Living Revolution. Now, it comes out of the 70s, but there's also been updates on that. There's a New Zealand book called How Nonviolence Works. And the difference, I think, is that they focus on stages of a campaign. So they acknowledge that it's about taking the right form of action at the right time. For example, there's most definitely a place for direct action in those campaigns, but how do we do it strategically? So that's at the campaign level, but I think at the wider level of what the movement does, I think, and again, it's time is the enemy, you know, there's so much that has to be done in a short time frame. I at least find it difficult to step back and think about the bigger issues. But for instance, just as an example, the Climate Action Network, which is a coalition of climate groups, is having a strategy session soon. It's a time to sit back and think, what do we need to do? That's the first question. Now, I mean, obviously what we need to do is preserve a livable planet. That's a big goal. It's probably not within the reach of the climate movement in Aotearoa. Within Aotearoa, what do we need to do? And then you further break it down. What do we need to do? And also, what can we do? It's important to be realistic. What can we do with our resources over a certain time period? What's the most important thing to do? I've suggested a couple of times that because the government's vulnerable on it, and because the damage it would cause is so great, opposing the fast track bill is a good strategic priority. But there are other things as well. Who are our allies who we can work with on at least parts of our program? It's very hard to get agreement on a big program. I've repeatedly seen that I've been around long enough that I've seen repeated efforts by environmental and climate groups to agree on a common program for the election campaign. And it's really, really hard to do. There was a relatively successful one that just said, I'm going to be a climate voter. So that was kind of all the agreement there was. As soon as you start arguing about should clause 10 say should or shall, then you're in trouble. So that's more of a non-answer than an answer, but I think also an openness to work with people who aren't the usual suspects, who aren't traditional allies. And again, we've certainly seen some of that in the fast track bill. Yeah, so that's a very partial answer, but it's mine. If anybody else has a comment on that, I'll be pleased to hear it.
Oh, very, very helpful for your weak spot. Thank you.
Thank you. I haven't told you about the other weak spots yet.
There was another hand up, but it seems to have disappeared.
Oh, Carol's got a hand up, I see.
Yeah, Carol. Oh, good.
And thank you, Tim. A very brilliant overview of the situation at the moment. I really appreciated your presentation. What I'd like to ask is, because you've been a lot more active than me over the last few years, you mentioned the Climate Action Network. We have Tapatahi. We have several efforts to try and pull our incredibly diverse movement together. And it's incredibly important. We know that the people, the vested interest side, if you like, is very good at having our climate minister recently referred to it as a broad church, whereas we tend to race off and make another group. And what do you see as a way of pulling us together so that we're a movement, and maybe valuing the breadth of what we can do? And I think there of what Māori said in the 81 tour, that the tip of the taiaha has to have the tip so that everything else can follow on. And so, you know, how can we value the Restore Passenger Rail people, the climate liberation people, who are putting themselves on the line and being disruptive.
Sure. Well, I think firstly, Carol, I want to acknowledge your long experience and the enormous amount of work you've done in that area, of nonviolent direct action and organising. I think, yeah. So we not only have, and I see Torfrida's here from Tapatahi, and maybe other Tapatahi folks as well. So we have both a lot of groups, and we have a number of networks of groups as well. And in some cases, I was going to say that the position on direct action differentiates some of those, but I think that's probably only partly true. I mean, I guess what I'd say about that is kind of relates to what I said earlier about strategy, that I think direct action is a really crucial part of it. Is a tool, right? It's not just a tool, but it's a way of campaigns achieving their goals. I don't see direct action as an end in itself, and I'm aware that perhaps I may differ from you on that. So I see direct action as a capacity that groups or campaigns should have, if it's the right sort of group or campaign, to achieve goals, rather than, I guess I don't see it as Group X is a direct action group and what they do is direct action, unless, of course, Group X is saying, I campaign for or against something. If you need a direct action component, then we can work with you on that. So I think that there's I mean, of course, as in any movement, there's all sorts of interpersonal issues and history and all that stuff that has to be dealt with. But I think groups that can give the movement capacity to take direct action are really, really important. But like everything else, the action needs to be strategic. To me, it needs to be designed to accomplish particular goals, is how I put it.
Thank you. Thank you. Over to Catherine.
We have Catherine, yes.
Catherine.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. That was really enjoyable. I'm sorry, I put my hands up and then down because I'm struggling to put my question, frame it properly, but you probably get what I'm trying to ask. Is it feels like the situation we've faced now seems so much more complicated. With Climate Justice Taranaki, we've been around for about 14 years. And in the beginning, well, at least for me, at that time, it felt quite clear, well, fossil fuels bad. And that's that. You know, we fight coal, oil, and gas. But now there seem to be more and more false solutions. When you read the draft mineral strategies, there's all this mining for so-called critical minerals that we must have because we're going to save the climate and go on to this just transition zero carbon goal. So there's so many these false solutions that are confusing the situation. I mean, we still have the old fossil fuels to lobby the industry to fight, but now we have all these things that just, you know, where do we fight and can we simplify it? What is there a unifying thing that we could, you know, say, is it economic growth? And do you have thoughts about degrowth? I'm a bit of a jumbo. And maybe any reflection on Simon Upton's 5 inconvenient truths, if you've probably read, and I felt a bit uncomfortable about those. But anyway, it's mainly about the false solutions and what you think about that.
Sure. I actually, I'll say at the start, and if it's okay with Pat, I'd like to come back to that. I actually haven't, embarrassingly, I've read Simon Watts's 5 principles, but not Simon Upton's 5 inconvenient truths. So if you could say a bit more about that. I mean, I think, yeah, so there is an issue about, do we need any mining? And if so, what mining do we need? I mean, there's a range of views about that issue. I think an area of agreement is, and actually, Torfrida's just referred to it in the Alliance building. She's mentioned the big March for Nature in Tamaki. So hopefully folks have heard about that. That was 20,000 plus people marching for nature, for te taiao, against the fast track bill. So I think, I hope that even the folks within the movement who say, okay, actually we do need some mining of these things, I hope can agree that that mining must not be fast tracked, that environmental protections must not be swept away, that proper consideration has to be given. I mean, personally, I was opposed to Labor's fast track, and when it came in, the COVID fast track, when it came in, I said, just wait till the Nats get hold of this. And unfortunately, that's exactly what happened. So there's one area. I think the next area, obviously, I should say this isn't me arguing for those projects, right? I'm just trying to kind of present the range of positions. I think the next thing is that there are folks within the movement who are more on the Green New Deal end, and there are folks for the movement who are more on the degrowth end. Now, I happen to think that some parts of those, there's actually quite a bit that those two groups can agree on, but obviously there's some that they can't. My view of degrowth, and I say this, I'm aware that our climate declaration has been quite involved in that area. I've been to several degrowth events. My view of degrowth, may upset one or two people are saying this, is that I think it's really important to pursue it. I think it's really important to put it into the context of what actual steps in Aotearoa, if we adopt a degrowth position, and of course work with, internationally to do that, what does it mean we actually do? Now, I've seen some good proposals on that. I sometimes feel as though degrowth is almost treated as a bit of a religion, where it's sort of I should say, is also true of Green New Deal. It's like degrowth is the thing, Green New Deal is the thing, rather than what does that mean? Let's take a look at Aotearoa. If we're going to degrow our economy, I think most degrowthers I've read would say that certainly worldwide, degrowth doesn't mean degrowing everything. It means in some areas, and particularly for economic justice, there actually needs to be some growth, but other things need to be reduced. Let's put together a policy program. Now, there's probably a program I don't know about, but I'm just thinking of going to meetings where like the degrowthers and the Green New Dealers just shout at each other, and to me, that's not terribly productive. So, Katrin, I know, I have, as you know, I mean, I've been to Climate Justice Taranaki Hui in actions. I wish I had the answer to what I wish I could say. I mean, I'm pretty confident and increasingly confident that the hydrogen economy was a false solution already, and with every year that goes past, it looks more and more false as it becomes more and more clear that hydrogen's applications are at best very, very limited. Even with steel production now, the move has been to electrode boilers rather than using hydrogen. So those are tough questions to answer, but it's good. It's good to ask them. And I just wanted to commend I can't remember the name of the strategy, sorry, Catherine, but that regional just transition strategy that Climate Justice
Taranaki 2030.
Yeah. And I think that's a really good approach for other regions to take, because again, it's going down that track of what should we actually do? Here's a detailed program. I think that's really, if you've got the capacity to do it, I think that's really important. Sorry, that was a very rambly answer. Hopefully it was something useful in there.
It was a rambly question.
Okay, do we have any more questions? No. I liked your mention of Toi to Taranaki. For those of us like me who haven't read it, then if it is, as I think it is, if it contains steps and a procedure, then that is really one of the basic things that we're looking for, how to get from A to B, isn't it? And whether it will end up being degrowth because the world is really, we've destroyed nature and there's nothing else for it but to be degrowth. Then we can only accept that. On the other hand, to avoid that situation, that is what we're all struggling for, is to avoid that cataclysm. All right, a final comment from Somebody?
Oh,
Otherwise,
Jack has his hand up.
yeah, Jack. Jack has a comment. Good.
Hi, Tim. I mean, you may want to say more about the climate issue in particular, but the question you just posed about a degrowth policy suite, in a nutshell, a first step could be rationing fossil fuels.
Yeah.
That would guarantee reduction in emissions in a way that the ETS and the carbon taxes couldn't possibly do, because you're actually controlling quantity directly rather than attempting to control it through prices. Now, that would obviously be very disruptive to the economy. So the importance of also instituting things like universal basic income and universal basic services and reduced work time, all of which would provide some sense of security for people during a very disruptive period in terms of adjusting to the reduction in fossil fuels over just a few years. So to me, those would be the outlines of a degrowth policy that would deal not only with climate, but with a whole range of other issues related to ecological overshoot. I'd be curious as to whether you have any comments on that.
Yeah, now actually, there's a question. There's actually a couple of questions. If it's okay with Pat, and without holding people, actually a couple of people I'd like to ask about things who I know are on this call. So, Paul, there was and there may be other people on here, but I'm spotting Paul there. I know there was some work being done by you're involved in, I think, Deirdre Kent and others about TECs, and I'm trying to remember whether that was tradable. What was it? Tradable energy
Quotas.
Tradable energy quotas.
Yeah.
TECs.
Which relates, I think, to Jack's question. And I was wondering where work got to on that.
Yeah, we presented a petition to Parliament, and the Green Party, what's his name, Willis, accepted it, and it hasn't been presented to Parliament yet, and so it's sort of disappeared into a hole at the present time, and I must say we're not quite sure how to pursue it, but I think that it was really Jack was involved with this campaign as well, and we got about 800 signatures, and we could have publicised it a lot better. But I think it is a really good scheme which would encourage innovation and be much more equitable than the present price rationing, which it means that people on lower incomes are really badly impacted by rising fuel prices, but a tradable energy quota would be an equitable quota to every citizen. And if you were able to find ways to reduce your fuel consumption, and most people initially would have spare quotas so that they could put them back into the market, let's say, and be paid something at the tender price, but they would continue to be allocated quotas for free.
Yeah. If I could just jump in with a short comment about in developing this proposal for Parliament, we did attempt to involve a range of other climate and social justice NGOs, but we didn't succeed very well. I think we could have put more effort into it, and it's an example of the sort of coalition forming that you were talking about to operate more strategically. We didn't do that, and I think if we did, we might be a bit further ahead on it.
I mean, I think thanks, Jack, and I think I'd end. I just probably need to make sure I say this, that I'll just go back to something I said earlier. There's a lot of work to be done. Actually, I didn't say it earlier. There's a lot of work to be done. We're also human beings. I'm reflecting on this at the moment because, I'm involved in a bunch of stuff. It's winter. People are getting sick. I'm getting older. I'm getting more prone to getting sick. We're we're not machines, we're people, we only have so much capacity. Some of us have more than others. And I think it, in addition to the large, in faced with the situation we're in, it can be easy to give ourselves about a hard time about what we haven't done. And I think it's really important that people, build on these strengths, but also come to terms with the fact that they're not robots. Well, unless there are any robots on the call, in which case I apologize. And that we need to look after ourselves and each other and be, recognise the limits on our capacity, as what I'm saying. I'm not saying you weren't doing that, Jack, but just that's, to do that kind of detailed work and to have the people who have the expertise and time and do it, it's really important, but it also takes a lot of resources. Now, there's a couple more messages in the chat I'll follow up in a minute, but I just wondered whether you, Pat, tell me if I'm going on too long, but I just wondered.
Another 5 minutes.
5 minutes, okay.
Yep.
I just wondered, Torfrida, you were saying in the chat about something that Tapatahi is planning coming up in Christchurch, and I just wondered if you want to say any more about that.
Unmute, Tor, you can unmute. That's good. No, it hasn't worked.
No, it looks like you're not coming through. Sorry, you're not on mute, but we're not hearing you.
Maybe now.
Sorry, do you want to find someone else? And I'll
Are we hearing you?
We can hear
We're
you now.
hearing
Can
Yeah.
you? Okay.
Good, go.
Oh, I was just mentioning, it was just really, we got inspired in Christchurch to do a similar rally to what the Greenpeace folk had done. And I think it's partly because it was quite intersectional. It was focused on the fast track, but they welcomed, that 20,000. They welcomed folk from lots of other sort of campaigns: social justice, renters, houses, unions, living wage, Palestine.
Yeah.
And it seemed to me that it's really important. That's what Tapatahi's been built on, really. Is it really important to reach across the silos of the different groups that we're in? That because there is so much energy, there is so much, people are starting to see the connections now. And I think having this government is a huge opportunity for making those connections, because people can see how, it just makes it clearer. And it means that it's getting easier to get people to come together to work on stuff together, because we can see how it feeds off one another. And I put a link into the video that Greenpeace did as a debrief after the event, because there's some really good stuff in there by Bianca Ranson, who was one of the folk at the organisers of the rally, and how they deliberately were trying to reach across the different silos of the different things that we're concerned about. And like Jack said, it's like you couldn't get degrowth unless you also don't have austerity, unless you do bring in income security, housing security, and you tax the rich, basically. So these things are interconnected. We can't get climate action. I think that's why we moved on to Tapatahi. We can't do climate action unless we all do these other things as well. Is that what you were thinking of?
Yeah, thanks, Tor. Yes, that's very, very helpful. And I just note also, I don't think I have the speech by Simon Upton that Catherine posted. But sorry, I actually had seen that, Catherine. I just forgot it had that title. But I mean, I think those challenges, whatever might motivate them, I think they are worth us thinking about, because I've found in the past that sort of media interview situations, when difficult questions are raised, usually I'm thinking, how do I avoid answering this and run the interview out of time so I don't have to give an answer, which works for media interviews, but it doesn't really work for media in the long term. So I'm not saying Simon Upton is right, but we need to think of, you know, convincing answers to the points he raises. And with that, I think that's probably enough from me. So over to you, Pat.
Okay, well, what can I say other than please, I will enjoy taking to heart your words about not being a doomerism and not being too low about the difficulties that we face. Everybody has to do what they can and realize that they only can do what is there within their time and emotional energy. Your emotional energy and your time seems to have to be so well spent. And so thank you for your example and your time now. So, po marie koutou. Thank you. Okay.
Kia ora and ka kite anō.